Dara Lind, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
Now, the number of border interceptions has fallen about 40% in the last few months. So, firstly, is that significant? And secondly, why do you think that's happened?
It's certainly significant. The question, of course, is whether we can extrapolate from here, and that is almost never. It's almost never a good idea to try to predict where border numbers are going to go. That's because there's a lot in why people come that has nothing to do with what the US policy is. For example, it's generally understood that the biggest factor in border numbers dropping since the end of last year is that Mexico has stepped up immigration enforcement throughout its territory so that people going northward are more likely to get intercepted. They'll get sent back down to southern Mexico and kind of end up going in a loop, or they'll be sent back to their home countries. We have no reason to know if that is likely to continue. In the past, Mexico has engaged in various immigration crackdowns, usually with the United States' encouragement, if not outright threatening. But it's never really stepped them up in a permanent way. So, and with the Mexican presidential election happening next month, although the president-elect won't then take office until the end of the year, it's not at all clear what the kind of state of Mexican-U.S. relations is going to be before our presidential election in November. So far, yes, it's been a very significant change, but who knows what's going to happen between now and when people go to the polls in the U.S.
Now, you cited Mexico's tougher enforcement on would-be irregular migrants as playing some role in those lower numbers. But why do you think Mexico has been providing that assistance? Does it have anything to do with Biden?
I would be shocked if the United States were not asking Mexico to step up immigration enforcement. That is something that presidents of both parties have been asking Mexico to do off and on, for the last 10 years, more than that at this point. So it's of course something that is in it's in the Biden administration's interests. That said, this president, the outgoing president of Mexico, has done more on immigration enforcement than his predecessors in general. He's, stepped up this National Guard, which is posted even along Mexico's northern border, preventing people from leaving and going to the US. He's, he was willing to work with the Trump administration when they were sending large numbers of migrants to just non-Mexican migrants to just live there for an indefinite period of time. So Mexico is seen a little bit more in its own domestic politics, a little bit more of the backlash to migration as the country has become not just a sending country, but a receiving country and a transit country for migrants. And so I don't think we've yet seen how that's going to play out in a post-AMLO Mexico.
Do you think there's potential for even greater cooperation between Mexico and America when it comes to immigration?
Potential, sure. But what we saw, okay, so in 2019, I alluded earlier to the policy that's known as Remain in Mexico, where the Trump administration would apprehend people, give them court dates, give them pieces of paper saying, here is your court date, and then send them back to Mexico. And they would let them back into the US the day of their court hearing and then ship them back again. What we saw during when that policy was in effect is that the US felt absolutely no need to provide support, to make sure that these people could feed themselves, that they had somewhere to live, to protect them from crime, because it was very obvious who the migrants were, they were very ripe targets for kidnappers. Mexico also saw no reason to, make a huge priority of getting these people set up. They didn't, it wasn't their policy. They didn't necessarily want to divert money from serving Mexican citizens. So in a lot of places along the border, there was just this kind of vacuum in which people existed, but no one was taking responsibility for them. I would think that if you're going to see more large-scale cooperation between Mexico and the US, not just in terms of, Mexico stepping up its immigration enforcement, for which there's just a ceiling because not every government has the capacity and technological capability that the US does, but in terms of agreeing to house migrants, which the US has increasingly seen as, one of only a few kind of permanent solutions to people coming to the US, then I think you'd probably see a change in the equilibrium of who was willing to take responsibility for these people. Because at a certain point, it's a security risk for countries to just have these places where, these this population of people who can easily be targets of crime, who can easily be kidnapped and ransomed, and absolutely no one taking accountability for keeping them safe.
What about Panama? Do you think their new president genuinely has the ability to stop migration across the Darien Gap? And if he does, how much of a game changer would that be?
If it were possible to stop migration through the Darien Gap, that would be enormous, because what we've seen since the COVID-19 pandemic is that really has become a major route and arguably the primary way for people to get to the United States. That said, there's no formal border between Panama and Colombia because the jungle through the Darien Gap has usually been considered to be impassable. It's only with the rise as a migration route that people have stopped just calling it impassable, but there's still no formal roads through a lot of that. It's incredibly dangerous terrain. I was in Panama last summer, right after the US actually announced a 60-day campaign with Colombia and Panama to stop the illegal transit of people through the Darien Gap. That didn't happen at all. And frankly, no one on the Panamanian side had taken it seriously. When I was there, Panama had only just gotten to a point of having several foot patrols going through the jungle at any given time. It's really impossible to overstate just how far Panama is right now from being able to even have the kind of surveillance that the US does across the US-Mexico border, much less the ability to shut down migration entirely. What we could see with Panama is once people come out of the jungle, they've been just bussed through on government contracted buses to Costa Rica pretty quickly because Panama didn't want people staying in their territory. If instead Panama were to do more to prevent people from traveling northward through the country after they've left the Darien, that could do more perhaps to deter people coming to the United States. But that would require Panama to accept that those people could be in their territory, which Panama hasn't generally wanted.
Now, Biden also has his parole program going. It's been going for a while. It allows 30,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans to enter America every month. They can stay for 2 years under the responsibility of a sponsor. But has that made any impact on the overall numbers of irregular migrants from those countries, seen as they now have a regular migration option?
So my understanding is that if you kind of crunch the numbers and run the counterfactuals, you can see that it's had an impact, at least for Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Haitians is a little different story. And one reason for that might be that in order to qualify for the parole program, you have to have not only a sponsor in the US who would be able to make above the poverty line, even if you couldn't get a job, although with the parole comes a work permit, but also you have to have a passport. And the current situation in Haiti is not such that there is, that there are a lot of U.S. consular or there are a lot of consular offices around that are able to get people passports that are able to smooth their travel to the U.S. So that could be a factor. But we have seen, and this is, this was a huge factor right after it was announced, and the effect has potentially diminished over time because the demand for these programs is just so great. But yeah, we have seen that, people, when they have an option, even if it's a fairly slim chance, the ability to just do something that gets them in line to the US does give them an alternative to just try to show up at the US-Mexico border and ask for asylum there. In terms of overall numbers, the thing that's been very interesting about the last few years is that the US used to have, one country or a few countries dominating in terms of irregular migration. And we don't right now. Last year, for the first time in recorded history, the majority of migrants coming to the US-Mexico border were not from any of Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And so because the geographic spread is so much greater, a program like the parole program, which targets people of particular nationalities, the effect of that is going to be smaller than it would have been in a world like the world we were in 10 years ago, where it was overwhelmingly people from those four countries that I'd mentioned.
This new rule that Biden's put in place, assessing some asylum seekers' credible fear allegations at an earlier point, do you see that making much of an impact?
So what the Biden administration has done, and this rule is stacked on top of another regulation that they passed about a year ago, which kind of similarly raises the standard at that initial screening interview phase. It's put a lot of weight onto that phase of the process. The problem is that the system, the entire asylum system is wildly under-resourced, and in particular, they don't have nearly enough asylum officers to conduct screening interviews for most of the people coming in. So over the last 6 months, at most a sixth of the people who are getting released into the US with asylum with court dates have actually gone through a screening interview first. So having the screening interview be more restrictive means that fewer people who are going through the screening interview may pass, but you're going to have fewer people who are even able to go through the screening interview because it now takes more time to ask all of these additional questions. So it's hard to see that it's going to have any kind of long-term impact, because what we've seen over and over again over the last 10 years is that when you crack down on a certain segment of people coming in, but that crackdown, you can't apply it broadly because you don't have the resources to do it, you don't end up getting the kind of deterrent effect that the government would want. People hear mixed messages because some of the people in their networks are getting through and others aren't. And when people get mixed messages, they overwhelmingly choose to believe the more hopeful messages are going to apply to them.
And are there any concerns about the extra power this gives potentially poorly resourced asylum officers to play judge and jury for migrants' applications based on sometimes not very much information?
That is always a concern. That said, that's a concern with the process as it currently stands. This regulation is not so enormous that it gives a ton. It's a moderate increase in their power, not an enormous increase. But it's generally true that in the U.S. with immigration and certainly with asylum, that there isn't a right to judicial review, that people who don't understand the law, which most of the people going through the process don't have any idea what makes an asylum claim, that the risk of somebody falling through the cracks or erroneous decisions getting made one way or the other is always somewhat high. But the U.S. is trying to balance the kind of due process that you want to make sure people have so that you're not erroneously sending people back to persecution, while at the same time not wanting to create a system and create a process that drags out for years and years and years and years, which is currently the situation we have because of resourcing. So there's always a concern between you want swiftness and certainty in decision making, especially if you want to serve as a deterrent, but you also do want to make sure that people have the ability to put together a case, and that case is being reviewed so that there's not just one unaccountable person.
Now, you hear this all the time on the news. So would you say that America's asylum system is fundamentally broken? And if so, how do you fix it?
I mean, I think that, sure, you can say that. I don't know what difference it makes from a policy perspective if you say that it's broken versus it's just totally overwhelmed and under-resourced. And the latter is definitely true. What you've had, for the last couple of decades, arguably the whole 21st century, is that Congress and the executive branch have put a lot of money into immigration enforcement and not a lot of money into immigration adjudication. As a matter of fact, the agency that asylum officers are under, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, is largely fee funded, but asylum applications don't come with a fee. And so as the number of asylum applications, especially from people arriving at the border, is increased from something like 5% 10 years ago to something like 40% now, that's an unfunded mandate on that agency that slowed everything down. So, in a world where the U.S. was committed to giving sufficient resources to actually having that process work in a fairly consistent manner, in a fairly quick manner, with more asylum officers, with more immigration judges, perhaps with, the federal government understanding that it doesn't really serve anyone to just dump people when you get them out of custody, to just dump them at a Greyhound bus station and, have them end up on the streets of New York or Chicago because they can't work legally. If you had some kind of, if there was some resourcing that kind of gave people a softer landing so that they understood what process they were supposed to go through and weren't entirely on their own, maybe you could, in the absence of bigger rule changes, have a functional system. On the flip side, if you keep changing the rules, but you don't give the resources to enforce those rules consistently, you're not going to improve matters. So I think, I think that there are certainly, ways that the kind of legal structure can and should be improved. But at the end of the day, you're going to need to throw a lot more money at this problem before you can fix it.
Of course, the best way to give much needed resources to the asylum system would be with new legislation. Would you say the moment for an immigration bill has passed, or is there still hope?
Well, because in Congress, appropriations happen regardless, even when other laws aren't getting passed, there has been a little bit of money for USCIS backlog reduction over the last few years. Congress really doesn't want to do that, though, because there's usually a bright line. They want to keep it a fee-funded agency. They don't want the American taxpayer to be on the hook for it. And I think that, there certainly are many members of Congress who aren't willing to sign away any money until they get a crack at changing the law. What we saw last winter, when there was for a while an insistence among Senate Republicans that, more military aid to Ukraine be paired with paired with border measures, that was the first iteration we've seen in several years of bipartisan legislation that actually put new ideas forward. The most significant of those ideas was not going to work at all. But there were some other ideas in there that would have made for a streamlined and faster, for better or worse, asylum process. It'll be interesting to see if those ideas kind of keep percolating as more must-pass bills happen and Congress kind of is forced to the table on this again, or if that's just abandoned and the assumption is just that we need to continue to throw more money at enforcement, which is exactly what we've done unsuccessfully for the last 10 years.
Now, Republicans keep saying that Biden has the power to go much further with immigration enforcement just on his own with no help from Congress whatsoever. Firstly, is that true? And if it is, why do you think he hasn't?
So there's a certain feeling in the US that, that everything that happens at the U.S.-Mexico border must be the result of U.S. policy, right? That there's no such thing as we talk about push factors and pull factors in migration, and a lot of elected officials in the U.S. talk as if there's no such thing as a push factor. That said, there's one tool in particular that the President Biden keeps saying he would like to use, but that his lawyers won't let him use. And so there's a possibility that there will be an announcement forthcoming that he's evoking something called 212F, which is a provision of immigration law that President Trump used for his travel bans that just prohibits the entry of a certain kind of person into the United States. The thing is that Trump tried that in 2018 to limit asylum. He tried to say, I'm, proclaiming that people cannot enter the U.S. between ports of entry, that they can't enter irregularly. The thing is that it's already illegal to enter the U.S. between ports of entry. People aren't going to stop just because there's a 212F proclamation in place. And so how you enforce it is really a question. And when the Trump administration tried to do this, which they got shut down in court pretty quickly, they were making this part of the screening interview where you would be prohibited from getting asylum if an asylum officer determined you were subject to this proclamation. So, of course, it runs into the exact same problem the Biden administration is already running into. If you don't have the resources for a screening interview, you can't enforce the rule consistently. You're just going to say no harder, but you don't have any way to respond if people disregard you.
Now, one of the knocks on Biden is that he hasn't been as zealous as, say, Barack Obama to deport rejected immigrants. Is that knock a legitimate knock? And if so, why might that be the case?
It's definitely true that interior enforcement has never hit the heights that it hit under the first term of Obama. There are a few reasons for that. One of those is that as many resources as have been thrown at immigration enforcement, there's still only a finite amount of money to deport people. And when more people are coming into the U.S., many of whom are being deported fairly quickly, but in the U.S., the border security debate is all about the number of apprehensions, which means even if everyone were getting deported, you would still see people freaking out that the numbers were too high. But if you have a lot of people coming in who are then getting deported, especially if they're getting deported to a bunch of different countries, that's a lot of deportation flights you need to run. And so that reduces the extent to which you can use that same budget to arrest, detain, and deport people who are in the United States. The other problem is when you're talking about newer arrivals, you know, at this point, the immigration court backlog is so bad that people are getting court dates years or even in some rare cases, like a decade in the future. You can't deport those people while they're waiting for their court dates. They're in a legal process. They're not legal immigrants, technically, but they are in a legal process. They are seeking legal status. So there isn't a whole lot that the Biden administration can do just using kind of the detention and or using deportation tools to get people who have just arrived in the United States. The the question of why there isn't more being done to arrest and detain and deport people who have been in the US for a long time, the Biden administration, like the Obama administration toward the end of his presidency, has taken the stance that these are people who often have been in the US, overwhelmingly have been in the US for more than a decade, who have put down roots, who have, developed community ties, and they would ideally like to see Congress give them enact a bill that would allow them to become legal residents and eventually citizens. And so it would be counterproductive to deport them. That is, at present, a very large policy difference between President Biden and what Donald Trump is running on in his 2024 campaign, should he be elected president again.
Do you think it'd be possible to undergo the kind of mass deportation campaign that Trump's been promising? And if he did pull it off, what would that do to America?
So it's hard to, I have not succeeded in wrapping my head around the number of resources that would be required to scale up deportation to this extent, right? Like, even in the Trump administration's first year in office, they were doing a lot to try to ramp up immigration enforcement. And they ran into some pretty significant obstacles because it's really hard to just identify where people who are in the US without authorization are living, to get them into detention and deport them without, once they've been in the US for a certain amount of time, they have a right to an immigration court hearing before they're deported, etc. What the Trump administration, or rather, what kind of Donald Trump's campaign or people around him have been saying about this is that they are going to use some legal authorities that they think are going to make it easier for them to deport some people without making them wait years for hearings, but also that they're going to be building large open air camps. And they're hoping that a lot of people are just going to decide that rather than staying in an open air camp for a year, they're willing to get deported. I don't know if that, I don't know to what extent that's going to be practicable. And I think that the question of, kind of at what cost to US communities is really substantial, because the other thing that they have said that Donald Trump would be willing to do is to mobilize the National Guard in Republican-led states to go into states led by Democratic governments, and to have, U.S. citizens from different parts of the country invading and arresting migrants. That's something that you could very easily see that leading to civil unrest, if not, outright, quasi-military confrontation. And it's hard to imagine a world where that could happen without substantial, conflict, not just between migrants and enforcement, but between Americans who support Trump and those who don't.
Finally, we don't talk much about the northern border. Obviously, there are far fewer migrants on the northern border, but there's a much higher share of migrants who are on the known or suspected terrorist list. So should we be more concerned about the northern border, or is it really just a non-event?
When you're talking about percentages, it's always important to remember that, if it's a very different base rate, right? Because there are so many fewer people coming in through the US-Canada border, even if it's the same number or a smaller number who are on the known or suspected terrorist list, it's going to look like a much bigger percentage just because there are, tens of thousands of people a month getting apprehended on the southern border. I think that we haven't seen substantial evidence that the U.S.-Mexico border, or that there's any kind of particular weakness to the U.S.-Canada border. There are certainly members of Congress who represent northern border states who have done a very assiduous job of making sure that Customs and Border Protection is like has a presence in their states, and they're, sending money to Vermont and to Montana and to the other states that make up that northern line. So it's not that it's been totally ignored. If you were to talk about strengthening it, you would have to identify a particular weakness, because otherwise you're just kind of, throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, which isn't usually it's usually a recipe for very rich government contracts, but it's not usually a recipe for results.
Dara Lind, thank you so much for joining us for a fireside chat.
Thank you.